I knew Darren disliked me the moment he strutted into my office that chilly Monday morning in Chicago 2014. His cologne was strong enough to peel paint, his salesman grin wide, but never sincere. He bragged about being a closer, though I doubted he could close a grocery tab without help. At 52, I'd been around long enough to recognize his type, and long enough not to care. For 20 years, I had built the $500 million partnership with Fairmont Industries, the account that kept our company running and half our staff employed. I had driven through Midwest blizzards to attend quarterly reviews, sacrificed anniversaries to handle emergencies at midnight, and memorized each executive's golf handicap and favorite bourbon. That account wasn't just part of my workload, it was the backbone of the company, and I had kept it strong. The problem was, Darren saw my history as a threat. He'd been hired 8 months earlier to modernize our division, which in corporate speak meant cutting corners and making flashy PowerPoints about synergy. He never admitted it, but the tight curl of his lip when James Fairmont, the CEO himself, greeted me before greeting him said it all. He hated me. On paper, everything looked fine, deliverables, met supply chain hiccups smoothed, and even 2 new regional expansions approved by Fairmont's board. But Darren kept circling like a vulture. He excluded me from account emails and then claimed it was an oversight. He jumped into my calls with Fairmont executives uninvited, derailing them with new processes no one had asked for. Each time I had to steady the conversation before he damaged the trust I had spent decades nurturing. By late fall, the tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. The year-end review with Fairmont was approaching the biggest meeting of the year. I had prepared everything: projections, risk assessments, airtight slides. Darren, meanwhile, spent his days in strategy sessions that always ended before happy hour. I assumed he'd at least glance through my deck before we stepped into that boardroom. That assumption was my mistake. The morning of the review, Darren appeared in my doorway with a smirk. "Got your slides, Van? I'll lead the presentation. You can chime in if there's time. No courtesy, no collaboration, just arrogance." I should have pushed back, but I also knew Fairmont's team. They respected me. If Darren wanted to strike the match, maybe letting him burn would show everyone where the real work had always come from. That afternoon, as sunlight spilled through the glass-walled boardroom and the rich aroma of coffee lingered, I felt the old familiar focus settle in. Darren had no idea the stage he'd just walked onto, or how badly it would cost him. James Fairmont sat at the head of the polished oak table, calm as ever, with his COO and CFO at his side. The rest of the executives nodded warmly in my direction, their respect genuine. Darren noticed. His jaw tightened before he launched into the presentation like a game show host overdosed on caffeine. It took only 7 minutes for him to start mangling the numbers I had spent weeks preparing. He rounded projections upward to make them flashier, ignored flagged supply chain risks, and bragged that our fulfillment rates were flawless when in reality we were operating at 94%. I tried to interject with light corrections, careful not to embarrass him, but Darren waved me off mid-sentence as though I were an assistant interrupting his big moment. Around the table, Fairmont's executives exchanged glances, polite but cooling. James Fairmont's pen tapped once, slow and deliberate like a warning bell. I could feel it, the shift. My credibility was being chipped away in real time, brick by brick, right in front of the very people I had spent 2 decades proving myself to. Darren either didn't see it or didn't care. He was riding the sound of his own voice, mistaking attention for approval. Every instinct told me to stop him before he did permanent damage. But then another thought struck me. Darren wasn't just undermining me, he was undermining the company's most important client. And people who manage half-billion-dollar accounts don't forget slights like that. They keep score. That realization made me lean back silent. Let him keep digging. If I was reading James Fairmont's eyes correctly, Darren had just taken his first overdraft on an account you never overdraw without consequences. He clicked to the next slide my slide and launched into Q3 projections as if he'd personally run the models. The problem was, he hadn't. He plucked facts out of thin air, cherry-picking the rosiest interpretations and ignoring the inconvenient truths I had carefully prepared Fairmont's team for. With our current trend line, we're on track to exceed delivery expectations by at least 12%, he boasted, tapping a graph that clearly showed only 6% over baseline. I opened my mouth to correct him, but before I could speak, he raised a hand like a traffic cop. We'll get to questions later. The COO's eyebrow arched. The CFO scribbled something down, never looking up. And James Fairmont. He stayed quiet, pen moving once across his notepad, as if recording the exact moment Darren crossed the line. I focused on my breathing, willing my expression to stay neutral. This wasn't my first boardroom battle. Clients can smell tension like blood in the water. Outwardly calm, inwardly seething, I let Darren continue dismantling months of trust, unaware that every false word he spoke was building a case against him, not me. Darren never spoke my name, but the implication was clear enough. I was the messy past he intended to clean up. Across the table, the COO's eyes flicked toward me, waiting to see if I'd rise to the bait. I didn't. Instead, I turned to James Fairmont, steady and measured. The client concerns we discussed last quarter are on track. The forecast I prepared already accounts for the seasonal dip in supply chain throughput. Our year-over-year gains remain consistent. My voice was calm, though my hand stayed folded in my lap to keep from gripping the table. Darren gave a tight laugh. Van tends to be cautious. I'm bringing a little optimism to the discussion. The room shifted. Not a word spoken, yet the silence felt weighted. Eyes moved, calculating, cataloging every nuance of the exchange. When Darren wrapped the presentation, he looked smug, utterly convinced he'd saved the account instead of straining it to breaking point. He closed the laptop, thanked everyone, and stood as if he'd delivered a masterclass. Then, casually, he dropped the bomb. One last note: Van's position is being restructured, effective immediately. She won't be your point of contact moving forward. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd misheard. My ears rang, heat prickling up my neck. He had just fired me right there in Fairmont's own boardroom, like I was disposable, not the person who had safeguarded their account through recessions, crises, and leadership changes. James Fairmont folded his hands, studying me like a chess player weighing the board after an unexpected move. No pity in his eyes, but something else sharp and calculating. I gathered my notes with deliberate precision. Thank you for your time. I told the room, my tone calm, though my heart thundered. I didn't glance at Darren, didn't give him the satisfaction of a glare or stumble. Walking out of that glass-walled room felt like crossing a line I hadn't chosen but would finish on my own terms. My career with the company might have ended in that moment, but something in me knew this wasn't the end of my role in Fairmont's story. Not even close. Darren's words lingered in the air like burnt coffee, sharp, bitter, impossible to ignore. If this story struck a chord with you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter, because the games of power and payback in the corporate world are far from over. Effective immediately wasn't just a termination. It was a performance staged in the highest profile theater our company had. Around the table, I heard the faint shuffle of papers, the subtle clearings of throats, but no one spoke. Because everyone understood this wasn't over. These were executives trained to stay composed in billion-dollar negotiations and hostile takeovers. Yet the silence that followed Darren's announcement felt heavy, deliberate. I could sense him watching me, waiting for a crack. Anger, tears, anything he could use to confirm his version of the story. But my hands were steady as I slid my notebook into my bag. Decades of dealing with CEOs and procurement sharks had taught me that words could be bullets or handshakes, and I wasn't about to fire the wrong one. James Fairmont's eyes met mine as I rose, unreadable as they had been throughout Darren's little performance. Still, I caught something there, a faint glint. Not sympathy, not approval exactly. Recognition. A silent note passed between us, unseen by anyone else. Darren, clearly unsettled by the lack of applause for his big move, rushed to fill the void. "We'll make the transition smooth," he said, his voice dripping with false assurance. "New talent is coming in to bring fresh perspective." Fresh perspective. Corporate code for replacing a proven veteran with someone cheaper, easier to control. I resisted the urge to laugh. Instead, I looked around the table, deliberately bypassing Darren's face. "Thank you for the partnership over the years. I wish you continued success." My tone was balanced, neither warm nor icy, just steady. If there was one thing Fairmont's team knew, it was that I never left loose threads. I stepped into the hallway, the glass wall framing Darren's forced smile behind me. Adrenaline drained, leaving humiliation prickling across my chest like static. 20 years of loyalty erased with a 2-minute speech. My inbox access would likely vanish before I reached my car. Downstairs, Tom, the security guard, and a retired cop who'd worked there longer than me, looked surprised when I handed him my badge. "They really letting you go?" he asked quietly. "Looks that way," I said, forcing a half smile. "Guess I'm free for lunch now." I walked toward the parking lot, replaying the meeting, every pause, every glance, every second of that steady eye contact with James Fairmont. There had been a flicker in his gaze just before I stood, a look like a man filing something away for later. The sting of humiliation still burned in my throat, but beneath it was something else. A dangerous awareness. This might not be as final as Darren thought. I knew two things Darren didn't. Fairmont's team trusted me more than they trusted him, and he'd just bet his reputation on delivering without me. In our world, bad bets come due faster than you think. By evening, I'd nearly convinced myself to stop checking my phone every 5 minutes. Nearly. The truth was, I didn't know what to do with myself. My professional rhythm, built over 20 years, had been ripped away in a single afternoon. I paced my living room like someone awaiting a verdict, Thai takeout untouched on the counter, a glass of wine sweating on the table. My bag sat on the couch, still holding the notebook I'd packed in front of Darren and the Fairmont board. When my phone finally lit up, I almost ignored it. A familiar number. Could have been HR or worse. Darren calling to gloat. Still, I swiped. A deep, measured voice said, "It's James Fairmont." I sank into the couch legs, remembering gravity. "Mr. Fairmont," I replied carefully, trying to hide the jolt in my pulse. "I'll get right to it," he said in the same tone I'd heard him use to close 8-figure deals. "I need someone to lead our vendor strategy team, starting immediately." I tightened my grip on the phone. Immediately, yes. You know our operations, our expectations, our history. I can't afford a learning curve right now. For a moment, I couldn't speak. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a lifeline thrown directly into the wreckage Darren had left me in, and the fact that Fairmont himself was making the call, that was the message. "Your first priority," he continued, "will be a comprehensive review of all supplier contracts for compliance. That includes," he paused, letting it land, "your former employer." The air in my apartment shifted, sharp and electric. "I see," I said evenly, though inside a hum of purpose had already begun. "I want honesty, Van," he said. "No diplomacy, no sugarcoating. If there are breaches, we address them. If they've failed to meet terms, we end it." "I understand," I said, and I did. This wasn't just an audit. It was a weapon, and he was placing it in my hands with no safety catch. His voice softened slightly. "I watched what happened today. I don't tolerate theatrics in my boardroom. I trust you'll handle this cleanly." "Of course." When we hung up, I stared at the darkened screen. The sting of humiliation was still there, but it had hardened into something sharper. Purposeful. Darren thought he'd ended my career. In reality, he'd handed me a direct line to the one man who could take everything from him. With James Fairmont's full authority, I was about to start pulling every thread I'd ever noticed in that company's tapestry, threads Darren didn't even know were loose. The next morning, I walked into Fairmont Industries headquarters, no longer a vendor rep, but their newly appointed director of strategic accounts. My new badge felt heavier than it should have, probably because I understood exactly how much damage it could unleash in the right hands. A war room had already been cleared for me, a long glass table stacked high with contract binders, performance reports, compliance audits, and more printouts than I'd seen in years. At the far end sat Lisa Cho, Fairmont's general counsel, sharp, disciplined, allergic to wasted time. Beside her was Marcus Vella, head of finance, the kind of man who could spot a missing decimal in a 300-page ledger without a calculator. Lisa slid a thick binder toward me. "We'll start with the Master Services Agreement. I want to know if your former employer has lived up to their side, every deliverable, every SLA, every clause." I opened it, scanning terms I knew almost by heart. For years I had defended them. Now I was dissecting them. The cracks showed quickly: missed delivery deadlines, sometimes by weeks, quietly adjusted in quarterly reports. I highlighted each one, marking the penalty clauses ignored. Marcus leaned in. "And how did they explain these delays?" "Logistical bottlenecks," I said, flipping to a section that made his jaw tighten. "But here's the kicker." I tapped the page. "They billed Fairmont the full contracted rate even while short-staffed. Direct breach of Section 4.3. Marcus exhaled low, the sound of someone calculating just how much money had bled away. By midday, the list was ugly. Overbilling disguised as rush fees never authorized. 2 straight quarters of missed performance metrics without adjustments. A subcontractor swap never disclosed, clear violation of transparency requirements. Individually, maybe dismissible. Together, the pattern was undeniable. It might as well have been framed and hung as evidence. Darren had either been too arrogant to notice or too incompetent to care. Lisa crossed her arms, expression sharp. "If this holds, and I believe it does, we have grounds for termination without liability." She paused. "Possibly damages. That's the goal." I said, my tone controlled, even as a cold satisfaction settled in my chest. Not everything would be smooth. But the cracks were wide and widening fast. 2 members of Fairmont's procurement team, both of whom had worked closely with Darren's people, seemed uneasy. They didn't defend him outright, but their reluctance to hand over certain emails made me wonder if they feared what I'd uncover. Allies and enemies don't always wear name tags. You learn to watch their hands, not their faces. Late that afternoon, Lisa handed me a slim folder. "Final step is confirming the breach clauses. We need this airtight, no wiggle room once it lands." I took it, my fingers brushing the cool metal clip. Inside were the legal equivalents of surgical instruments: precise, final, and, if used correctly, irreversible. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, coffee pot at my side, laptop glowing. I cross-referenced every clause against the violations we'd documented. Each checkmark was another nail in the coffin Darren had been unknowingly building. By midnight, the list was finished. No gray areas, no speculation, just facts, dates, signatures. A story Darren would never talk his way out of. The sting of his public humiliation was still fresh, but it had hardened into something sharper, honed to a point. He'd embarrassed me in front of the very people I respected most. Now I would dismantle the one thing he valued above his ego, his biggest account. And when I finished, it would be clean, surgical, the kind of loss that doesn't just sting, it echoes. By week's end, the war room looked like the aftermath of a legal hurricane. Evidence binders sat neatly stacked, each labeled in bold marker: missed deliveries, overbilling, subcontractor breaches, non-compliance. Lisa's legal team had triple-checked every fact, cross-referenced every date, attached supporting documents. This wasn't just a termination packet, it was an autopsy report on a once lucrative relationship, complete with cause of death. Lisa closed the final binder with a crisp snap. "It's airtight. No arbitration, no cure period. They're in breach beyond repair. We can terminate immediately with zero liability. Marcus leaned back, arms crossed. Given the account size, losing this will hit their quarterly revenue like a brick through glass. Lisa turned to me, expression unreadable but eyes sharp. Question is, do you want to deliver it? There was no hesitation. Yes. It wasn't about gloating. This wasn't revenge theater. It was about control, about ensuring the last word came from me, not Darren. He'd staged my exit for maximum humiliation. I would return the favor with maximum precision. Lisa slid the termination letter across the table. It was only a few paragraphs on Fairmont Industries' letterhead, but every line was a loaded round. Dates, clauses, direct citations of breaches, each one a bullet Darren couldn't dodge. At the bottom was James Fairmont's signature, bold, deliberate final. We'll go in together, Lisa said. Marcus will handle financial disputes on the spot. But once you hand this over, it's done. They won't talk their way back in. Understood. That night, I barely slept, not from doubt, but from adrenaline. I could already see Darren's face when he realized what I was holding when it hit him, that his star account wasn't slipping away slowly but vanishing now. I laid out my outfit with the same care I gave high-stakes negotiations. Neutral colors, clean lines, no jewelry that could clink against the table. Nothing to distract from the letter. I even printed a second copy just to savor its weight in my hands. The next morning, Marcus met me in the lobby. Ready? He asked quietly. I gave a small smile. More than ready. We rode in silence toward my old office. My heartbeat pulsed in my fingertips, not from nerves, but sharp anticipation. For days, I'd been gathering ammunition. Now, I was walking into enemy territory to pull the trigger. Inside, the receptionist froze for half a beat before recovering with a polite smile. My old badge was gone, but the Fairmont visitor pass clipped to my blazer sent its own message. Marcus handled the greetings while I stood silent, the termination letter in hand, feeling the weight of every step since Darren's little performance in Fairmont's boardroom. This was the inmost cave, the point of no return. I wasn't here to knock. I was here to sit across from Darren and end the only thing propping up his career. Perfectly, cleanly, on my terms. As the elevator doors opened, the air shifted. Same stale coffee smell, same gray carpet, but now every glance lingered a fraction too long. People noticed the silver Dalton logo gleaming on my badge. I could almost hear their thoughts turning. Darren's assistant Chloe looked up from her desk, eyes flicking to Marcus, then back to me. Her voice caught before she said, "Van, he's in his office." Without waiting for permission, I walked past her. Marcus followed close behind, leather portfolio in hand, looking like it held meeting notes when in reality it carried Darren's downfall. Darren was leaning back in his chair when I stepped inside, scrolling on his phone. When he looked up, his face flickered through 3 stages: confusion, recognition, and finally that oily smugness I'd seen 100 times. He set the phone down and gestured to the chair across from him, as though granting me an audience. "Well?" he said, leaning forward with his elbows on the desk. "I didn't think you'd be back so soon. Couldn't stay away?" I didn't answer. I smoothed the letter on his desk and slid it toward him. His eyes landed on the Fairmont letterhead. His smirk widened. "What's this? A pitch to win you back. I hope it's better than your Q3 forecast." "Read it," I said flatly. His eyes narrowed, but he picked up the document. At first, his posture stayed loose, but by the second paragraph, where the breach clauses were laid out in black and white, his smirk faltered. By the third, his hand stopped moving altogether. Beside me, Marcus shifted his weight, silent, a witness to every beat of the moment. "This is a joke," Darren said finally, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "Fairmont can't just—" "They can," I interrupted evenly. "And they have." Effective immediately. The room fell quiet except for the low hum of the HVAC. Darren's gaze darted back to the letter as if a reread might conjure a loophole that didn't exist. I kept my expression neutral. No smirk, no raised brow. He didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me revel in it. When he looked up again, the arrogance was gone, replaced by something tight around his mouth. You think this hurts me? I think it changes things. Marcus placed a second folder on his desk. Financial reconciliation. You'll need to process this today. We'll handle the offboarding of system access immediately. Darren stared at him, then back at me. But I was already rising. Goodbye, Darren, I said politely, almost pleasantly, as though ending a routine meeting. And in a way, I was. His fingers twitched as he turned to the next page, the faint rasp of paper louder than it should have been. The arrogance he wore like cologne was evaporating fast. His eyes darted across the clauses, missed delivery metrics, unauthorized, subcontracting, overbilling with proof attached. Each line was a lock clicking shut. Finally, his voice cracked. This is exaggerated. You've been waiting to? But he never finished. The door swung open and David Harkin, the CFO, stepped inside. I hadn't seen him in years, but the look on his face made it clear this wasn't a courtesy visit. His skin had the pallor of a man who'd just received news you don't walk back from. Darren. Harkin's voice was clipped, his eyes fixed on the letter in Darren's hands. Is that what I think it is? Darren didn't answer. He just shifted the pages so the Fairmont Industries letterhead was visible. Harkin came closer, scanning the text. His jaw tightened. You have any idea what losing this account does to our Q4? It's half our projected revenue. Half. Darren began to stammer something about negotiations, but Harkin cut him off sharply. There's no negotiation. This is final. I stayed silent, watching the realization hit Darren in waves. First came the numbers losses so large they would ripple through every department. Then the politics, the board meetings, shareholder calls, late-night damage control that would now define his life. Finally, Harkin glanced at me. He didn't smile, but there was understanding in his eyes. He knew why I was here, and how deliberate this moment was. Darren, meanwhile, looked smaller. Still clinging to scraps of control, but every second the letter sat in his hands was another second of authority draining away. Effective immediately, I reminded quietly, my tone even. The satisfaction was there, but I buried it under calm restraint. This wasn't about gloating. It was about precision. Darren had chosen to humiliate me in front of the one client he couldn't afford to lose. Now that same client had sent me back to dismantle him from within. And I was doing exactly that, one page at a time. I rose from the chair, deliberately letting the scrape of it against the floor punctuate the silence in his office. The letter still hung limply in his hands, suddenly heavier than he could hold. I smoothed the front of my jacket, squared my shoulders, and met his eyes long enough to speak. This is effective immediately. Darren's mouth opened, a protest rushing to the surface. But before he could form words, Harkin cut in, voice low and sharp. Stop talking, Darren. You've already done enough damage. The words landed harder than anything I could have said. Darren's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between us, searching desperately for a foothold that wasn't there. He found nothing. I turned, opened the door, and walked out without another glance. My heels struck the hallway tile in a steady rhythm, each step carrying me farther from the wreckage I had left behind. The air outside Darren's office felt different. Lighter, cleaner, untouched by the arrogance that had poisoned it for months. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed. One new message: James Fairmont, perfectly executed. The corner of my mouth lifted just barely. No one else needed to see it. No one else needed to know that the humiliation Darren had tried to brand into me had been erased quietly, completely. Outside, the sun was sharp against the Chicago skyline, the air brisk with that early winter chill that wakes you up straight to your bones. I paused for a moment, breathing it in. I didn't rush to my car. I didn't check to see if anyone was watching me leave. This ending didn't need an audience. It didn't need applause or a victory speech. The only thing that mattered was this: Darren was finished. And I was the one who had closed the book on him, clean, final, and entirely on my terms. For 20 years, I had been the steady hand keeping that $500 million account alive. Darren thought he could erase me with a smug announcement in a boardroom. Instead, he'd handed me the chance to dismantle him with precision. In our world, endings rarely come with fanfare. They come with binders stacked on conference tables, clauses highlighted in yellow signatures in black ink. And sometimes they come with a single message from the right person at the right time, perfectly executed. As I stepped into the cold afternoon, I realized something else. My career wasn't over. It had just shifted. Fairmont trusted me in a way Darren never understood, and with that, trust came power Darren couldn't take back. I walked slowly across the plaza, the city buzzing around me, the visitor badge still clipped to my blazer. A symbol really not of exile, but of transition. I wasn't leaving in disgrace. I was leaving in control. By the time I reached my car, the sting of humiliation was gone, replaced by clarity. Darren had chosen spectacle. I had chosen strategy. And strategy always lasts longer. The account was safe. My reputation was intact. And Darren, he was nothing more than a cautionary tale.